Thursday, the 26th of June. This is your Business Morning with me, Bosin Amafaye. We're live to you from Lagos, Nigeria's financial and economic capital. Let's get the 1-hour programming on the way right now. The big story for the African markets, emerging and frontier markets to be more precise, not just within Africa but around the world, was the Bloomberg Emerging and Frontiers Forum held yesterday at the Bloomberg European headquarters in the city of London. And of course, a number of African market operators, head of markets and other important personalities were in attendance discussing the state of the global economy and markets and what it means for emerging and frontier markets, part of which Nigeria and other countries are. So let's get a bit of a sense of from those attendees and put some of what was said yesterday at that very big event into perspectives. Let's cross over straight away to our London studios, where the Chief Executive Officer of Botswana Stock Exchange is joining us this morning for this conversation. Thapelo Seshole, thank you very much. Good morning, sir, for coming through on the program. It's good to have you.
Morning.
Thank you. Nice to have you on the program.
Good morning.
Thank you so much. Okay, now let's get this conversation. A very big event yesterday, sir. So what were some of your takeaways looking at the global issues and reading those tea leaves correctly for the African securities market?
Yeah, I think some of the big global issues from yesterday's discussion was the impact of the policies that are done by developed countries, especially them being very protective of their territories in terms of trade, and its consequential impact in the African market, especially also in the securities market, and also the issues surrounding the trade wars, mainly between the U.S. and other major countries, because ultimately this creates a lot of uncertainty in the markets. And when there is uncertainty in the markets, these uncertainties are much felt by frontier or emerging market than developed countries, although it is not the frontier market that actually creates these uncertainties. But because they exist, investors end up postponing their investment decisions. And then ultimately, they can invest in Africans' markets, especially in the securities market.
You are the CEO of one of Africa's most vibrant exchanges. Are you worried with some of the concerns that you heard about yesterday? And how do you think we can mitigate them now? You'll be flying back home to Botswana and you'll be meeting with your team, perhaps government officials. How do you think we should process this and protect and get the African markets a little bit protected from what the global headwinds is looking like at the moment?
Yeah, I think one of the things that African markets have to seriously do is to encourage a lot of trade among themselves, because there's a lot of potential that is there within African markets to do a lot of intertrade, which remains largely unexploited. To an extent that you'll realize that a lot of African markets actually trade with global markets than they trade among themselves, and therefore I think we need to increase or make the conditions conducive in our African markets to increase inter-Africa trading, because I think if we do this, we'll be able to reduce the extent or the impact at which these global uncertainties impact in African markets. And therefore, in going back, and also as the chairman of the SADC stock exchanges, I think it's one of the things that I'm going to be really advocating for, that it is now generally time for African markets to really increase trade among African stock exchanges, because you realize there's just so much potential that remains unexploited.
So within the Southern Africa development community, is this more of stock exchanges or financial markets or financial system managers like yourself as a CEO of Botswana Stock Exchange? But do you think that there's a need for government, the regulators, the fiscal authorities to come in here and help us achieve or fast track the things we need to do very quickly?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that they need to come together to help us achieve the things that we need to do. But I know in the southern part region, I attend high-level meetings with central bank governors and also SADC finance ministers, where we discussed a lot of regional integration and regional intertrade. And I think we have made headways in the last year or so in terms of project, in terms of the market microstructure that we have put in place to pave way to encourage much more of intertrade among SADC countries.
Okay, so what's the new direction at the Botswana Stock Exchange? It's been a bit of a topsy-turvy year for a number of African markets. Nigeria has been a bit of a topsy-turvy. We've seen a few listings here at home. What are the big stories for Botswana Stock Exchange? For example, the Airtel Africa is doing a global IPO on the London Stock Exchange. Do you think we should see more of these on foreign listing, or you think we should do a bit of a cross-border listing, more cross-border listings within the SADC region between the SADC and East African community and perhaps West Africa?
Yeah, I think what we should be doing a lot is we need to develop our markets in such a sense that a majority of companies, and some of them who are mainly doing business in Africa, need to list in Africa and need to be able to raise capital in Africa and not necessarily rely on developed markets to raise capital while their projects are in Africa. And therefore, where there are situations where these companies are already listed somewhere else in Europe, I think as African stock exchanges, we need to lobby these companies and we need to lobby authorities to convince these companies to ultimately dual list in our market, because that also helps to uplift the status of our African markets. And then further, it is even in terms of the standards of the African market, that also help us. And therefore, I think we are doing very well. I mean, Botswana, for example, is one of the countries that have got a number of dual listings in London and also in Toronto and also in Australia. This also helps us to increase the credibility of our markets, because you realize that these companies are able to conform to certain international standards that ultimately make the locally listed companies to also benchmark from them and also up their standard in terms of reporting and also in terms of the way they run businesses.
A final question for you. I'm sure you, as the head of a stock exchange, you keep one permanent eye on what is going on around the world with central bankers. There are talks about likely U.S. economic recession, interest rate direction in the U.S. and Europe, and the trade fight and what have you. Do you think the central bankers, or what more do you think the central bankers can do? What is the Central Bank of Botswana doing? And do you think the role of central banks are changing over time, looking at the various core economic challenges that they face in trying to help the various governments mitigate these headwinds?
Yeah, I believe that with the trend in the changing economies around the world, the role of central banks will continually be under scrutiny. More especially that the shocks that are likely to come out as a result of the trade wars, as a result of issues surrounding interest rates in developed countries, that ultimately affect the movement of capital globally. The role of central banks is going to be very crucial, especially in their take in local economies that they operate with, because we cannot really divorce their role from the general economy that they're operating in. And I'm happy to say that, I mean, in Botswana, for example, you realize that I think we continually have discussions with the central bank with the role they can play in the market in terms of market development, capital market development, and also with the role that they need to create a conducive environment for the securities market to thrive. Mainly because the central banks, by their nature, are the major economic advisors to the government. And therefore, I think in our conversations with them, we are able to relay a message also to lobby government to create a conducive environment for the securities market to thrive.
Okay, so just bring us up to speed about the Botswana Stock Exchange. How has your stock market performed so far in 2019, and what's your outlook for the rest of the year? Mr. Zapello?
Yeah, I think we are doing relatively well when I look at the macroeconomic fundamentals that are existing in the country and also around the world. Trading levels, of course, are not as high as they were 3 years ago, but that is the trend around surrounding African securities market. But I think we have not been as badly hit as other fellow securities market in Africa. And therefore, even in terms of the index, I think it's been going slightly up after experiencing some negative movements over the past 2 or 3 years. And therefore, we are quite optimistic that I think we are doing relatively well. But you know, in Botswana, 2019 is election year. Elections are in October, and therefore elections by their nature generally affect investment decisions. Investors sometimes postpone the investment decisions until after the elections. So there is that lag that we are experiencing in terms of investment, which I think after October, I think things will start to normalize to better situation.
Thapelo Teshole, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Botswana Stock Exchange Limited. Thank you so much for your time today. And anytime you're in London again, do check in at our London studios. Thank you so much. Do have a great day and a safe flight back to Botswana.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. See you next time.
It's great to have you. See you next time. Thank you so much.